Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this video lesson about institutions of the United States government. This is the executive branch, and I'm Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So let's get cracking. All right, so just a quick review, the three branches of government. Now, we've already talked about the legislative branch. I've given you a very brief overview of the executive, and today we're going to focus in on that branch. And later video lessons will discuss the finer points of both the judicial branch, and that rounds out the official three branches. But with the growth of the federal government, you have the addition of the unofficial fourth branch, the bureaucracy. And that will be the subject of its own video lesson down the line. So, the key powers. So you have executive powers, you have diplomatic and military powers, legislative powers, and judicial powers. All right. So the powers of the presidency have grown exponentially since the beginning of the founding of our country. Originally, the executive was designed to be very limited in scope. Okay, the executive branch was not supposed to be the star of the three branches of government. Okay, it was supposed to be the legislative branch, which comprises Article 1 of the Constitution, also known as the People's Branch. But over time, the powers of the presidency and of the executive branch generally have grown quite a bit. And over the course of the next week or so of class, we are going to explore both the advantages and disadvantages of that expansion and have some deep discussions about whether or not that expansion was a good idea or not. And so we will be discussing those deeper issues. But before we can, we need to get a solid foundation of what each of these powers are. So let's start with the first couple, the executing the law, right? The executive powers. So two things support this idea, the idea that the president must execute the law: the oath of office and the Constitution itself. It explicitly states that this is the power and duty of the president. The president must enforce all federal law, all right? So sometimes presidents take some heat because they're enforcing laws that some of their the people that voted for them don't agree with. But the president is not empowered to decide which laws he will follow. That would completely undermine the separation of powers and checks and balances. The president must enforce all federal law, whether he agrees with it or not. And I say he because we have yet to have a woman president, but I have a distinct feeling that that is going to change. Relatively soon. I'm going to make a prediction now. Within the next 10 years or so, we will be able to see a female president. But currently, it's only male, so we're going to use he. He has no choice. He has to enforce all of it. However, the executive can and must interpret federal law. So if Congress doesn't do a very good job of explicitly stating what the law is, what it is designed to do, that is where the executive is allowed to interpret. And interpretation, as we should know, can go a variety of directions. The more vague the law is, the more authority the president has in implementing it. So it's important to note that if you have a problem with how and why the president is doing something, your first stop needs to not be the president, it needs to be the Congress. And you need to take up that issue with them and maybe look at how or why they wrote the law the way they did, and perhaps it needs to be redone. There's also the ordinance power. The ordinance power involves executive orders. Now, these directives, rules, and regulations do have the force of law, but they can be very quickly overturned by Congress. Congress can overturn any executive order with a simple act of Congress. They can overturn it instantaneously. And any president that comes into office after the previous president enacted executive orders, they, as the new president, can undo them with another executive order. So executive orders do have the force of law, but they don't have the staying power of congressionally passed acts of legislation. So it's important to keep that in mind. And under this ordinance power, he's allowed to issue these executive orders, and they can range from anything involving national security to establishing national parks and holidays and things like that. So the president does have a fair amount of lawmaking power, but again, this power is very easily checked by the legislative branch if they chose to use that power to check the president. Most of the time, they do not. So the appointment power. The appointment power is big. The president has to obtain the consent of the Senate, however, for all of these things. Okay, he cannot appoint unilaterally. There are certain federal offices designated by Congress, lower offices that are part of the bureaucracy that the president does not need to seek congressional confirmation for. But the big ticket items, the cabinet positions, Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, all those things require consent of the Senate. So the president appoints ambassadors and other diplomats, cabinet members and their top aides, heads of independent agencies, all federal judges, U.S. Marshals and attorneys, and all officers in the armed forces. So he has a wide appointment power, the president does, but many of these positions require congressional approval, specifically Senate approval. And if the Senate does not approve, these people cannot take those positions. Now, in cases where the position needs to be filled and the Congress is in recess, as in they are not in active session, the president can fill these vacancies, okay? And so this person can take that office and serve. However, as soon as the legislative session ends for that year, the appointment expires and they have to then go back through the regular confirmation process. So this is not something that can be done all the time. It's a relative rarity. But it is possible to do that, but it's not permanent. That person cannot serve past that initial legislative session. The removal power. These are fun. So the president also has the power to remove any appointed officials. It doesn't offer, the Constitution doesn't offer specific procedures or reasons, but the president can remove just about anybody except judges, independent agencies, okay? Unless they are brought up on charges and you've proven misconduct, then those folks can be removed. But he can't just, I don't like the way you ruled on this case, I'm removing you from power. You know, he cannot do that with judges, and he cannot do that with independent agencies. We'll talk more about what independent agencies are when we get to that segment of our content. But those are the two areas that he cannot remove people at his leisure, at his pleasure. But anybody else, bye-bye, within the executive branch. He also has executive privilege. So he can, under this protection, refuse to disclose information to Congress and to the courts. This is in place so that people who are speaking to the president, people who are advising the president, can have the ability to speak freely without fear of reprisal. Now, there's a lot of potential abuse for executive privilege. And so there have been a variety of items passed to prevent the president from abusing executive privilege. And we'll talk more about that in class. But the president does have this ability. So in the instance of national security, where he can't disclose information because it would potentially harm the United States, he can refuse to provide that information to Congress and the courts. This has the potential for widespread abuse. Diplomatic and military powers, ladies and gentlemen, diplomatic and military powers. So as chief diplomat, he has the power to make treaties, executive agreements. He has the power of recognition and the power to declare persona non grata. Now, treaties. He can make treaties, but he can't enforce the treaty unless the Senate approves it. The Senate must ratify the treaty. If the Senate doesn't ratify it, it doesn't become a thing. And this has happened throughout American history. One prime example is the League of Nations with under President Woodrow Wilson. This was the baby infant version of the United Nations. Woodrow Wilson tried to do this to prevent another world war, and he got all these countries to agree to it. He signed it, but the Senate didn't ratify because they believed that the League of Nations undermined the authority of the United States. So the League of Nations collapsed. Without its primary benefactor, primary supporter, it did not hold. And then, of course, we erupted in World War II. But that was an example of the president cannot make unilateral treaties. He must have approval and consent of the Congress, Senate specifically. Executive agreements. It does have the same standing as treaties, but it can't go against federal or state laws. So if a federal or state law conflicts with this executive agreement, it doesn't, the federal and state laws would overpower that. So if you wanted to make an executive agreement because you couldn't get a treaty through Congress. You could do that. But if anything in that agreement went against federal or state law, then it's gone. It is not supreme. Federal and state law are supreme to executive agreements. Has a power of recognition. The president can acknowledge the existence and sovereignty of another nation. That is the purview of the president. Persona non grata. Recalling an ambassador for another country, from another country, and declaring them an unwelcome person, right? And recalling a U.S. ambassador from another country to show displeasure. So when this happens, this is a prelude to war. This is one of the first steps that a leader is going to take when they're intending to engage in military conflict. When you pull your ambassadors from that country and you expel their ambassadors and send them home, that's an indication that you don't want diplomacy anymore. You're ready to escalate the conflict. So this is rarely done. It has been done, but it is rare. And usually when you see that happen, you can just assume that hostilities are about to open up. Commander-in-Chief. This is probably the most well-known power of the president. Diplomatic is probably the least well-known. A lot of folks don't pay attention so much to diplomacy as much as we used to, maybe. Maybe we never did. I don't know. I feel like a lot of people don't really think about the stuff we just talked about with, persona non grata and power of recognition, that kind of stuff. We pay attention to treaties. But the persona non grata part, I don't know that we pay so much attention to, but we definitely pay attention to commander-in-chief stuff. He runs the armed forces, the president of the United States does, and has complete control in times of war. If you have an openly declared war, the president has complete authority when it comes to the armed forces. Any decision involving the armed forces, the president can do what he likes. Don't ask, don't tell, DAT, which is not a thing anymore because it was overturned under President Obama's administration. Don't ask, don't tell was put into place as in an effort to remove homosexual and transgendered persons from the military. So before it was, you were basically just summarily removed. However, if you were able to hide it well enough, your superior officers were not allowed to ask, and you did not have to tell. You did not have to answer if asked. If they asked, are you a lesbian? Are you a homosexual? Are you trans? That you did not have to answer this question. The problem is that even the asking of that question means they already assume that you're guilty, and under the military code of conduct at that time, it was justified to dishonorably discharge you. There's a famous quote from a soldier who died and he said, they gave me a medal for killing a man and a dishonorable discharge for loving one. So it was an interesting seeming contradiction. But now, Don't Ask, Don't Tell is no longer military policy. It has been officially overturned, as the Defense of Marriage Act has been also. It was known as DOMA. An act of Congress was necessary to get rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell because an act of Congress initiated it. So in the case of DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, that was overturned and declared unconstitutional via the Supreme Court in 2015. But for many years, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was the law of the land since President Clinton put that in action. And an LGBTQIA plus service member was dishonorably discharged. And a dishonorable discharge, in case you didn't know, counts as a criminal record. So if you are dishonorably discharged from the military, it's the same as if you have been convicted of a crime in terms of trying to seek employment. If you were working in a school, for example, or trying to work in a school, if you have a dishonorable discharge, that's going to be a problem for you. Now, the president can make undeclared war, okay? He can make undeclared war, but he is limited in that power. He is limited 90 days. The president can send troops anywhere he wants for 90 days. Past that point, he has to go hat in hand to Congress and ask for permission and money to continue the conflict. If Congress does not expressly grant the permission, then the troops have to come home. Now, the president, under the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which was passed in response to the Vietnam War, which was an undeclared war, they gave the president 3 options for sending troops. If Congress has declared open war, if Congress has authorized the action, or if an attack on the nation or armed forces has occurred, the president must respond. So if an attack has occurred, the president is under the War Powers Act, can respond and send troops and react. But again, after 90 days, he's got to go to Congress. Legislative powers. The president has the power to recommend legislation, okay? Most major legislation in this day and age does come from the president, but Congress still has to tweak it and fiddle with it, and it has to be approved by Congress. Just because the president says this is a good idea doesn't mean it actually happens. The president has to work with congressional leadership to create this legislation that actually can get through both houses of Congress. You've got a lot of masters to satisfy here. So just because the president proposes something doesn't mean it's going to become law. This is worth noting when people are running for president of the United States and they're promising all these things that they're going to do. It helps to have a basic understanding of how government actually works, of what the president is actually empowered to do. For example, the president has zero powers in terms of controlling taxes. None. Oops, got a little excited. None, no powers controlling taxation. Okay, that is completely under the purview of the Congress. So the president can suggest, but he cannot force. Now, in terms of legislative options, he does have options. He can sign the bill and it becomes law. He can veto the bill and it goes back to Congress. If he does nothing for a specified period of time, it will become law anyway. And there's this thing called the pocket veto, which we'll explore more in class. That's a very particular circumstance where that can be used. We'll talk more about the pocket veto in class. Ask me about it. He also can call Congress into special session in cases of national emergency. He can call a joint special session of Congress, and they all must come. In the cases, like we have done this in the past when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, we've done this. So there were things that, various instances in history that led to joint sessions being called. Veto power. So, okay, I forgot that I had this in the PowerPoint, but okay. So instead of asking me, I'll just tell you about it. So Congress has to be out of session. So maybe they pass the bill, right? They vote it, they send it to the president's desk, and then the session ends, right? They're out, they're going back to their home states to do what they're due. If the president does nothing, the bill ends up dying. So if they send it to him and they're out of session, he can just wait, and then it'll die. This is used at the end of a legislative session. So he doesn't have to actually officially veto the bill. He can just let it sit there and it'll just not become law on its own. He can also attach a veto message. He can sign the bill into law, but he attaches a statement that says, this is why I don't like it. I'm signing it into law because the pros outweigh the cons, but the cons are bad. And people should be aware that I do not approve of this. So he can attach a veto message. There was this thing that was in play for a little bit called the line item veto, where the president was able to look at a bill of Congress and cross out things he didn't like. And only the stuff that he didn't cross out would actually become law, and he would sign that. Congress passed this. Congress gave the president this authority, which I find incredulous, because the Supreme Court said, that is a direct violation of separation of powers. You are taking away the legislative lawmaking power from the Congress and giving it to the president. Absolutely not. So there's a direct violation of separation of powers, but it bears mentioning and paying attention to the fact that Congress wanted the president to have this power. They were willingly giving over this power that they had and giving it to the president. No bueno, ladies and gentlemen, no bueno. So he also has judicial powers, and these involve reprieves and pardons, right? He can postpone a sentence where, okay, you've been assigned this sentence, you've been convicted of this crime. It doesn't clear your record. It doesn't remove the possibility of you actually serving the sentence, but he can postpone it, right? He can pardon, which gets rid of it, legally forgives you from the crime. The power is absolute except for cases of impeachment. The president is not authorized to do that. It can only be used for federal offenses, so state offenses are not eligible for the presidential pardon. Instead, they are eligible for a governor's pardon. These are known as powers of clemency under the Constitution, and the person being pardoned must accept it. He can also commute the sentences. He can say, okay, your conviction stands, but I'm going to reduce, or I'm going to just, let you out now. I can reduce the amount of time you've served, and I can just cancel the rest of your sentence. He can also grant amnesty, and this is a group a group pardoning of lawbreakers. One example was Jimmy Carter granted amnesty to draft dodgers of the Vietnam War, so anybody who dodged the draft was absolved of that crime, so he granted blanket-wide amnesty for that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, ends the big picture stuff of the executive branch. I hope you learned what you needed to. I will see you in class where we will discuss in much greater detail many of these contentious issues. So I love you guys. Have a good one.